Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I know we have a couple new faces here tonight. Allison Gibson is here, a new attendee. We've got
Patrick.
Patrick also is here. He said you've been to a couple meetings in the past, but it's been a while, Matt. I think you were on the online meeting that we had last week.
Yep.
So welcome, everybody. We've got a little bit of a smaller group here tonight in-house, but we've got a fair number of people that are showing up online. So once again, thank you. This is our second meeting of 2025. We had one meeting last week that was a lot of fun, the exhibition night. And tonight we have visiting us from over Zoom from Boston. We have Silvana Della camera. She's going to share her secrets of capturing amazing time-lapse videos with our cameras. Something I've been really looking forward to this one, in that I've only done it a couple of times and not entirely successfully. So I'm really looking forward to learning how to do it. I would really like to go and do a little bit more of the video captures of time lapse and that. So like I said, I've been really looking forward to this one. Just going through a couple of other things that we've got. I'll go through our events through, I guess, July. We've got February 5th is our open competition night. And I believe it was Cliff Lawson is the judge for that. Is that right, Bruce? Yeah, Cliff Lawson is the judge. So again, first competition is open, so no themes. Anything goes as long as obviously it's appropriate. So that'll be first Wednesday of February, February 5th. February 19th, we have a change from our program. We before had digital asset management. That one's being moved out to November, and instead we have perspective and perception, the myth of style with Lewis Katz. That's February 19th. March 5th, we have another exhibition night, similar to what we did last week. March 19th, Lightroom masking with Eric Hagerman. That's a presentation night. April 2nd is our next competition, and that one is a themed competition, and the theme on that one is leading lines. April 16th, Fundamentals of Digital Printing with Lewis Katz. That one is we'll be presenting over Zoom also, but we will be meeting in person. May 7th is another exhibition night. May 21st, presentation on Galapagos Islands with Roger Frame. June 4th is our next competition, and that one is open. June 18th, we have Capturing Time, Daytime Long Exposure Photography with Jürgen Lobert. And July 2nd is a exhibition night. And then keep in mind, this is the one you want to keep in mind in advance, but we have on July 16th is our annual project. This again is, we did it last year where you have a certain period of time in which you can choose you choose a project ahead of time. You have a certain window of time to take images that all represent what your project is. And then that period of time that you take those images is from June 1st to July 13th. And then at our July meeting, we'll be sharing those images. I think did we say up to 4 per person, or do we increase that?
For
the project.
I think we're gonna try to do 8.
Eight images per person as part of a project.
Yeah, 4 was up to 8. It
Up to
doesn't
eight.
have to be 8.
Doesn't have to be 8, but up to 8. Okay.
But if you don't do 8.
Right. But it was a lot of fun last year, so I look forward to seeing what people come up with this year as far as projects and ideas and that. So again, that one comes up between June and July 13th, I guess. A couple of other things that I wanted to bring up. Exploring the Light is the competition that the call for entry is now open with a deadline of February 13th. And Cheryl Opperman is the judge for this year's event. This again is over with the city of Lone Tree. I think Darren, you were the judge last year for this. Always a good event, up to 3 images that you can submit. More of the information, there's a out on our website, there's a link that will bring you to the Exploring the Light page. But we usually get a lot of our members that submit images for that, as well as images that come from other parts of the state, and even I think some of them come in from out of state. So I was a
Win money.
fun. And you can win cash awards for the top 3 images, I think, in each of the categories. As far as what those categories are for this year's competition, we have landscape, leading lines, motion, portraits, and wildlife. We'll go ahead and introduce tonight's guest speaker. Thank you again, Silvana, for joining us tonight. Silvana is a software engineer by trade. She began her fascination with photography as a very small child. Decades later, her passion still remains. Photographing what the eye can't perceive is what she loves best to capture. Uh, she was past president of the Stony Brook Camera Club and recipient of many photography awards. Her images have appeared in Lighthouse Digest, Yankee Magazine, the Boston Globe, and were featured in Nikon's 100th birthday celebration. She helps other aspiring photographers through her photography workshops, photo walks, photo tours, private instruction, and club presentations, various photography topics, including infrared, something that's near and dear to my heart, Milky Way, black and white, nightscapes, deep space photography, and time-lapse. Time-lapse, again, is what she'll be covering with us here tonight. She's also a master member of the New England Camera Club Council and a member of Professional Photographers of America, PPA. Also has authored some books, including Breakers of Darkness, The Majesty of Lighthouses, Sights Beyond the Spectrum, Digital Infrared Photography. I'm gonna have to look for that one. And a new book coming in December of 2024, meaning evidently it's already out, is Nightshades, A Guide to Photography After Dark. So with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Silvana. We'll have, again, share her knowledge with regards to time-lapse photography. Looking forward to this one.
Thank you kindly. Glad to be here. So thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm a night owl, so if you wanted to prolong and get through your work ahead of time, don't worry, you're not keeping me up. I'm nocturnal, more like a vampire. At any rate, tonight we're going to talk about time-lapse photography and what you can do with your digital camera to achieve digital art with, digital video rather. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things that I just want to let you know about. So this is the book that Michael had mentioned. I was published last month. It is basically a brain dump of night photography. That is really my realm of work. Nightscapes, astral landscapes, and time lapse and infrared. And this is my latest book. This is available as a digital edition as well as a softcover book, high quality images. And basically, it covers everything nocturnal, cityscapes, which means even your uh, backyard, star trails, Milky Way photography, aurora, you name it, right up to lunar and solar eclipses. Now, solar eclipses aren't nighttime, but they are a celestial body, and it does take some skill and requirements to photograph. So the sun is fascinating to shoot, and this covers the gamut of night and post-processing and planning of these funky things when you're fumbling in the dark. This is the book that also Michael had mentioned. This is a book that covers infrared photography digitally. Digital infrared is a lot easier than film infrared, but it still has its quirks. And to prevent people from diving into the rabbit hole that I went down when I first started digital IR, this book covers how to the various infrared conversions, right through how to process these funky infrared images. And this is the lighthouse book. As you probably can tell, I have a lighthouse fetish because my background actually has a lighthouse. This came about as kind of a catharsis. I was often told by friends and family that I needed psychiatric assistance because I am so obsessed with lighthouses. But it didn't really help. The obsession, if anything, increased. So if you have a lighthouse hound in your life, this is something that they might enjoy. I also teach workshops and also hold photo tours. If you've never been to Acadia National Park in Maine, it is a phenomenal place and a wonderful place for astro landscape photography. And I have two tours, one in the spring and one in the fall. This is the spring one happens at the end of May, and I can't believe we're already talking about spring 2025, but it'll be here before we know it. So what a surprise. I also have a lighthouse crawl on Cape Cod. So if you're in the area and you want to visit some of the wonderful lighthouses on Cape Cod, I welcome you to join me. And as I mentioned before, autumn in New England is quite spectacular, and it's especially so in Acadia National Park. And you can contact me through the various social media channels. Um, I love hearing from folks, so if you have any questions about anything, if you have questions after the presentation that we don't cover tonight, please feel free to reach out. So, essentials of time-lapse photography. We have powerhouses in our digital cameras to create really incredible views of the world that we cannot naturally see. And tonight we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the history. I'm a big fan of history. I like to know where things come from, why you should consider shooting time lapse as a photographer. We're going to talk about gear. We'll talk about getting ready to photograph a time lapse. There's a little bit of math involved, nothing overwhelming. And we'll talk about post-processing. So, time lapse dates back to the 1870s when a British photographer by the name of Edward Muybridge captured the very first time lapse. And he photographed a galloping horse in California at a racetrack. And he set up 24 cameras in series, and he set up a device to trip the shutter as the horse was going by. And this is what he ended up with. You're actually watching the time lapse that he created. Since then, it has been used in feature films. The very first time it was used in a feature film was by the French director Georges Méliès in 1897. And he was a very creative director, and he really put time lapse to really interesting use. In 1982, the very first documentary film completely done in time lapse was released, Koyaanisqatsi, or Life Out of Balance. This was followed by two more films in the series. In my perspective, the very first one is the best. Philip Glass actually scored the film, and it's really interesting to watch. Now, keep in mind that this was done completely with film, so it was quite an undertaking. Nature documentaries use time lapse extensively to help speed up events, to show us a view of the world that we just cannot naturally see. If you've ever seen PBS's programs Nova or Nature, or the BBC's programs The Blue Planet or The Private Life of Plants or BBC Earth, these all use time lapse extensively. Construction companies often use time lapse to document the building of skyscrapers, which take years to build, and time lapse gives a view into the construction of these massive structures. The Solar Dynamic Observatory did a 10-year time lapse of the sun. Every second that you view is actually 24 hours. When we view the sun, to us it looks like a stagnant, very bright object in the sky. We cannot perceive the movement at all. But this time lapse gives us a view of our sun as it is a very dynamic, very active star. This was comprised of 425 million high-resolution images taken at an interval of 5.6 seconds between each frame. And if you want to watch the entire 10-year time lapse, you can actually watch it on YouTube. It's a full hour and it's fascinating to watch because you can see solar flares. You can see the transiting of the planet Mercury across the sun. It's quite fascinating, and it gives us a real appreciation for our closest star. This is from The Secret Life of Plants, and I'll let Sir David Attenborough speak to it.
We often don't notice such dramatic behaviour because, to our eyes, it happens so slowly. But if time is compressed and you shift perspective to the plant's point of view, their world comes spectacularly to life. The events in this woodland can build to a view of half a year in less than a minute.
So we just witnessed 6 months of activity in an English garden in less than a minute. And it's pretty wild to consider that. And that's the beauty of time lapse. It compresses time. So why shoot time lapse as a photographer? Our lives revolve around still images, just frozen instants. However, our digital cameras have made the creation of time-lapse much more obtainable. Time-lapse with film was incredibly difficult because you had a set limit of frames per roll, maximum of 36 frames. So you have to have hundreds of frames to create a time lapse of at least 10 seconds, let alone, feature film length. So time-lapse gives us a new dimension to our photography, and our cameras are multi-purpose. It's not just taking a frozen instant at a time. It has the capability of also compressing time. It allows us to visualize time passing, and it allows us to see changes in our world that we cannot naturally see. Time-lapse speeds up things that appear to be moving very slowly, like the Milky Way that's crossing across the sky as our Earth rotates. Shadows moving across the ground as the day progresses. We can watch clouds forming and dissolving. And what's cool about time-lapse is that it imparts a three-dimensional effect to the final video. Here's a time lapse that I shot with a 500 millimeter lens of a moonrise at a lighthouse south of Boston. And what's cool about this is we can watch the moon rise, but we can also see all of the activity of the people that are around the lighthouse also observing the moonrise. Milky Way traversing the sky. That big blob right here is actually Jupiter, and that's Saturn. And what's cool is you can actually see a lot of activity. If you're standing there at night, you really can't notice all the things that are happening. But time lapse allows us to see the activity that is actually in front of us, but we don't pick it up. You can create a time lapse on any segment of time, meaning fractions of seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, and decades, as you saw with the Solar Dynamic Observatory with the sun. That was full 10 years. You can create a time lapse on any scene. Our view has a lot of unperceived movement, and time lapse can bring this movement out to us and actually show us that it exists. You can get started with time lapse with really simple subjects, such as clouds. You can photograph wilted plants coming back to life, for the lack of a better word, after a good drink. You can photograph a city street, you can photograph the tides, and you can even use ice cream. I started my journey with time lapse photographing ice cream melting at my kitchen table. So it gives you a really good understanding of how to photograph it and the little caveats that you have to be aware of. So you can start with very simple things. So here is a very sad New Guinean patient that needed a drink. So I gave it a drink and started shooting. And this is comprised of 657 frames. It was shot over a span of 32 minutes, and you could see the how it was and where it ended up. Now we've seen the plants revive many times, but to watch it actually reviving in front of your eyes is something to behold. This I shot in Acadia National Park. It's comprised of almost 1,100 frames, shot over 50 minutes of time, and it's just fog. And we often think of fog as something that doesn't have any actual physical force, but looking at the time lapse, you could see that it actually has effect on the trees and even the water. It's quite interesting to watch. This is a summer afternoon in Boston at the Boston Public Garden, and I just decided to start shooting a time lapse. That's the beauty of digital cameras. You can just start shooting. If your memory card is large enough, you can just start shooting a sequence on the fly, and then you can go back and revisit the time that you were there and pick out different things that could have happened. In this particular sequence, what caught me was the reflection of the clouds reflected in the Hancock building here. Within about 20 minutes of this sequence, the sky cleared and the magic kind of left. As I noted, I am heavy duty Milky Way shooter. Nighttime fascinates me. And here is a Milky Way sequence that I shot early in the Milky Way season. And there's a lot of air glow in this. This is why the sky looks green. But it's fascinating to watch the reflections of the stars on the water. Time lapse can also reveal patterns or trajectories. It reveals traffic patterns. You can watch how plants are growing, the patterns of lights, trajectories of planes, stars, weather, aurora, volcanoes, you name it. So that pink building, I watched this for many years. This building has always been lit up, but until I put this sequence together, I had no idea that the lights had a pattern to it. You can also photograph cars. This is the Zakim Bridge, and I photographed it, the cars coming in and out of the tunnel that's right beneath me. This is golden hour going into blue hour at Pemaquid Point Light in Maine. It's just fun to watch the change of the light and the activity that is around the lighthouse. So what do you need? Pretty simple. You just need your DSLR or mirrorless camera. Pretty much any lens will work for time lapse. Prime lens, wide, super wide lenses, even a telephoto, as I showed you earlier with the time lapse of the moonrise at the lighthouse. That was a 500 millimeter. You do need an intervalometer. So if your camera doesn't have a built-in intervalometer, you can just use an external one. For cheap money, under $25, you can get one and really control finite time on your camera. Nikon and Canon both manufacture their own intervalometers. They look exactly like this one. This is actually a picture of the one that I've had for over 10 years. And these things take a beating and they work well. I don't recommend buying the Nikon or the Canon one because they're about 160 bucks. So if you step on it, you won't cry. So you will cry for that one. You won't cry if you step on this one. And I highly recommend the wired intervalometers versus the wireless. If you're shooting a long duration sequence, a lot of times the wireless ones will lose contact with the receiver and basically will mess up your time lapse. I I really follow the KISS mentality, keep it simple, stupid. So the wired ones, yeah, they're a pain in the neck. They're not that pretty, but they are reliable and they're cheaper. You do need a solid tripod. So these are the two musts for time-lapse photography in addition to the camera. A travel tripod or a spindly little weak tripod will not really work for you when creating a time lapse because you need something rock solid. Anything that imparts movement to the tripod will register as a jitter in your time lapse. So you do need something solid. As for the intervalometer, the beauty of these things is it allows interval timer shooting on cameras that don't have a built-in intervalometer. You have fine control over time adjustments. You can also extend the camera's shutter speed. Most cameras have a maximum shutter speed of 30 seconds, but this gadget allows you to keep the shutter open for as long as you want. It also works as a shutter release. So this is a screenshot of a Nikon menu. Pretty much all the camera manufacturers that have built-in intervalometers have a similar type of menu. Interval timer shooting is what I use. A lot of cameras also have the ability to create a time lapse built in. So what it does is it shoots the individual frames and then puts together the time lapse within the camera. But you don't have control over the end product. So if you need any adjustments to each frame, you lose that capability. So the camera does it all, but if you've never tried to create a time lapse, it is a good way to dip your toes into creating time lapse. It is addicting, so just be warned, but it is a good way to begin your journey. You can also add an axis of movement to your time lapse. So I showed you the tripod. There's also sliders that you can put on your camera on, and it moves your camera either horizontally at a 45-degree angle or even vertically. What that does is it gives your time lapse an added visual interest. This is a panning head. This is actually made by Syrup. Um, what this does is you connect this to your camera and it's controlled by an app and it fires the camera for you. And it actually moves the camera in between each shot. So you add that rotation in your time lapse. This is a slider, and this is also another gadget, also by Syrup. This actually sits on the carriage of the slider, and if you place this on top of this, this will move the camera across the slider as the camera is rotated by this. So you could add a lot of visual interest by adding accessories to create your time lapse with. I highly recommend using a dew heater. Even if you're shooting during the day, um, if there is a high dew point, what you will discover is that your lens is getting damp. Yes, we often clean our front element with a wipe, but if you're shooting a time lapse, that feature goes out the window. You cannot touch your camera when you're shooting a time lapse. So for 20 bucks, you can get a dew heater and it keeps the front element of the lens nice and dry. Dew heaters come to us via astronomers. They use dew heaters to prevent their telescope front element from getting wet, which blows their night shooting. But these are cheap and they work incredibly well. They're powered by the same power bank that, juices up your phone. You can also shoot many hours at a time by using a dummy battery and a power bank. And then you're not limited to the length of the battery, the life of your battery, rather, that tend to vary from manufacturer. But if you have a camera that is notorious for eating batteries and spitting them out, this is an option to do long duration time lapses and not run out of battery power. So here's an example of dew ruining a time lapse. Notice the blob that's being created in the center of the frame. This was a time lapse that took about 3 hours to shoot, and it was blown. But I wanted to show you what dew does to a time lapse. That's really hard to say. So here's another time lapse with, let's see, would I use a panning head on this one? No. But you can see the activity of the people, the sky moving and so forth. Now, I'm showing you a lot of short sequences just to give you an idea of what to shoot. This is a bridge in Portsmouth, New Hampshire that changes color constantly. And it's pretty much imperceptible to the eye, but it's really, really pretty to shoot in a time lapse because you can actually see the colors changing. This is sunrise in Death Valley, and this was a pretty long duration time lapse, but you can see the sun coming up over the mountain and lighting up the mud flats and creating this really cool starburst. You can also shoot in infrared. Tend to shoot double-fisted, meaning two cameras at once. And this is just a time-lapse sequence that I shot with my infrared camera. So what do you need to shoot? Well, just like anything in photography, you need to figure out what your subject is. Figure out your foreground and your framing, and then you go from there. So, excuse me, to create a daytime time lapse takes very little time because you're using short shutter speeds and you can zip out a time lapse within about 10 minutes or even less. So set your exposure just the way you do now with a single frame, and then you set the interval. The interval is the amount of time between each shot, and then the number of frames. And we're going to talk about the number of frames that you need to create a satisfactory time lapse. Nighttime time lapses are a little bit different because you're shooting with longer shutter speeds, and that by definition expands the time of the amount of time that you have to shoot. So you need to shoot for at least an hour and a half when shooting at night versus the short minutes during the day. So let's do the math. This is probably the hardest thing for photographers to wrap their heads around because we're used to dealing and thinking about frames in a singular way. We're not thinking about another dimension of time, which time lapse is all about. So video/movies have a frame rate, and the frame rate is between 24 to 240 frames per second. So for 1 second of video, we're talking about 240 frames for a 4K video. If we're talking about what we're doing, we're talking about 24 to 30 frames per second. So for each second that you're seeing, it's comprised of let's say 30 frames just for ease of numbers. So once you understand how many seconds you're going to be shooting, your goal is so many seconds of um, video, and then you know that you're going to need 30 frames for each second of video, then you can just do the math. It's pretty simplistic. Now, I caution you to do time lapses. Your goal is to have at least a 10-second time lapse. The longer, the more pleasing. The shorter, anything less than 10 seconds, you leave your viewer unsatisfied. It's like it's too short and it doesn't feel right. So, having said that, let's take a look at the quick reference guides. Now, I'm going to be sending you a cheat sheet with some stuff on it. So, the thing to keep in mind when it comes to time lapses is use these reference guides as a guideline, but not gospel. So, use them with a grain of salt. So here it gives you examples of things to shoot. So if you're photographing, say, a city street, you'll have 1 second between each frame. These are going to be probably relatively short exposures, and you're shooting for about 2.5 minutes to get a 10-second time lapse. If we're shooting cumulus clouds, now we're having an interval 2 seconds between each frame, and you're shooting for about 10 minutes. Now notice the longer the span of time between each frame, the longer the duration of the shoot. So if you're looking at cirrus clouds, now the span of time between each frame is longer because um, cirrus clouds appear to move very slowly. So you have a longer span of time between each frame, and you're shooting for about 25-30 minutes. Now, stars at night, this is where I tell you to take it with a grain of salt. It's saying that the interval should be 45 seconds. No, I use an interval of about 10. So it's basically the shutter speed for night photography, which could be, depending on the NPF rule, could be 10 seconds, depending on your camera. And I always add 2 seconds. So that's roughly, a fourth of the time that this chart is telling you. And yes, you do shoot for at least an hour and a half, but the longer that you shoot, the better it is. If you're photographing the sun moving across the sky, now you're taking a shot every minute, and now you're looking at like a 5-hour shoot. So this is where the long battery power comes into play. So, and you get the drift. And I'm going to be sending you this as well. Just keep in mind, you need at least 300 frames to create a 10-second video. Nothing short, less than that. Here's another chart. A little bit more topics that it's covering, and it just gives you a feel of what you're looking at in terms of shooting length of time to shoot and the interval. Now, the interval, from my perspective, is based on how you want to have your time lapse look. I like very smooth looking time lapses, so my intervals tend to be on the short side. But each person, just like anything that you shoot today, it's based on your goals, your likes and dislikes. So just keep that in mind and don't feel like you have to be stringent in terms of what the interval should be for your time lapse experiment. There are also time-lapse calculator apps that are free and work very well. They help photographers get a grasp of this other dimension called time. And as I said, it's one of the hardest things to get your head around. So here's an example of the tool that I often use. So based on, to give you an idea, a 5-second interval, if I want to shoot for 2.5 hours, it's going to give me 1,800 shots. You can alter any of these elements here and the numbers change, which is very helpful. It's also helpful in terms of understanding the amount of how big your memory card has to be. So my camera is like a 47 megabit um, e sensor, so it's a pretty big file. So I'm looking at 84.6 gigabytes. Now, a lot of people when I'm teaching time lapse, they're like, "Oh my God, that's a lot of space. My hard drive's going to be full." Well, just keep in mind, storage is cheap, and um, don't let that hold you back from trying time lapse. Once you calculate everything and you set your camera to fire off, you get yourself a comfy chair, you get yourself some snacks, a beverage, and you let your camera do your work, and you just sit back and you enjoy the view. It's another aspect of time lapse, which is great because as your camera is doing the heavy lifting, you can actually enjoy the scene. This is something that we as photographers often forget to do. So things to keep in mind when you're shooting a time lapse. Be sure your tripod is level. It's one of the things that is very critical, especially if you're using a panning head. Your tripod has to be level. If you're using a DSLR, make sure that you close or cover the eyepiece so you don't have extraneous light coming in and whacking your frames. Set the exposure and take test shots and keep an eye on the histogram um, and adjust up and down as needed. We're going to talk about the importance of ND filters and why you want to slow down the shutter. Um, so once you get the focus set, hands off. Switch your camera to manual focus so it doesn't focus on each frame. There's some cameras that once you set it to interval timer shooting, it keeps trying to focus, and that creates a mess with your time lapse. So just keep that in mind. Set up your interval, the space between each frame, and make sure that your memory card is large enough. Um, I use pretty big cards, but again, it depends upon the size of your sensor. So just keep that in mind. Rule of thumb, the shorter the interval between shots, the smoother resulting looking time lapse. So fast movements usually use shorter intervals. Slow movement requires, or no, they say recommends a longer interval. But as I said before, you are the artist. You determine how your time lapse you want it to look. So time lapse tends to look best in landscape mode, but that's not a hard, fast rule. I also showed you a time lapse in portrait mode. Adding an additional axis of movement adds a lot of visual interest to the resulting time lapse. Always shoot raw and in manual mode. Aperture priority can result in flicker, and I'm going to show you what that means. And a lot of my students get all excited for time lapse because they want to shoot either a sunset into night or sunrise into day. But honestly, um, walk before you run. That kind of time lapse requires bulb ramping, and it's a lot more intricate to execute. So start with simple and then move up to bulb ramping. So let's talk about, before we get into the shutter rule and the 180 shutter rule, any questions? I know I'm doing a lot of dumping of data here.
You see any questions?
No, I'll have a couple questions probably towards the end, but you may already be ready to answer those in the part that you're going over right now.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Don't hesitate to interrupt. Okay, so one of the things that we adopt as photographers creating time lapses is a rule that comes to us via the film industry, which is the 180-degree shutter rule. What is this? Well, it is a rule that generates a very smooth, natural-looking video. how often do you see a video that has a choppiness to it or a unnatural feel to it? It's because the shutter speed is too high. And the 180-degree shutter rule comes into play here because it says it's 1 over the frame rate times 2. So remember how I said we use either a 30 frame per second or 24 frame per second frame rate? This is where the calculation comes into play. So if you're using a frame rate of 24, then the correct shutter speed is like 1/50th of a second. For 30 frames per second, the 180 shutter would be a 1/60th of a second. What this means is you want to use maybe an ND filter if you're shooting during the day to bring that shutter speed down to one of these numbers that gives you a very smooth looking time lapse when you put it all together. If you use shutter speeds higher than that, you end up with a jittery feel, a choppiness, especially if you're photographing people that are moving or anything that has movement, it adds a jitter to it. But if you're using a slow shutter speed, for like this is the maximum, you can go lower, you just can't go higher. So here is ice stream melting. This was shot in aperture priority. See the flicker that's happening? This is what happens with aperture priority. So what happens is every time when you're in aperture priority mode, every time the camera takes a shot, it opens and closes the blades of the lens. This is equivalent to our pupil opening and closing. And what that does is, even though none of the settings have changed from frame to frame, what happens is that the blades opening and closing brings just a little bit more or a little bit less light than the prior frame. And what happens is you end up with this jitter. So there, like my camera has exposure smoothing in the interval timer shooting. See if your camera has that and turn it on. What that does is it tells the camera I'm shooting a time lapse. So I want you to not adjust the blades of the lens when I'm shooting in this mode. It only applies to aperture priority. It doesn't apply to manual mode because it only does the in manual aperture priority rather. So just keep that in mind.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, Savannah, real quick, there was a question that came up in the chat, and
Sure.
Kathy Allen Chin was asking what ND filter you would recommend, and I guess, and I think probably is that like a 3-stop, 6-stop? Is it dependent upon the light that you're working with to try and get your shutter speed down to what you're talking about there?
Yeah, it depends upon like how bright you're dealing with. I start off with a variable ND because it's a lot easier to get where you need to be. I use a 2 to 9 stop Tiffin ND filter, and that has a big enough range to get me where I need to be that I can get to that shutter speed that I need to have to be at. Now, I also have 100 by 100 the square filters, and I also use those. So you can use a 3, 6. It depends, but usually 3 to 6 gets you there. But I find the variable NDs work really well for time lapse.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. So a time lapse sequence is multi-purpose. What do I mean by this? Well, here's a time lapse of fireflies that I shot right around the corner from my house. There's a wetlands, and you can see the stars reflected in the water, and you could see the fireflies flitting around. But you can also stack a time lapse, and when you stack a time lapse, you end up with something like this. The fireflies now, you can see them in abundance. You can see the star trails in the sky and in the water. So every time lapse that you shoot has more than one purpose, which is a lot of fun to play with. Here's a time lapse of the stars rotating around this lighthouse. And you can tell they're rotating in a circular fashion. I'm facing north. And when I put them together, I have star trails. So this is the resulting stack of the time-lapse frames, and I put together star trails in this case. You can also create cloud stacks. So here is the bane of my existence, which is clouds. We get a lot of cloud cover in Massachusetts and New England in general. So every time they say it's going to be clear, it usually isn't. But you shoot, when you make lemonade. Did I hear a question?
We've got a black screen back there. Maybe this was it. Is it a lighthouse? A lot of streaks?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So this is the resulting stack from that time lapse with the clouds. So you can get some really interesting painterly type images. And these are just the clouds when you stack them. And with some starlight coming through. So for post-processing, what I recommend is LR time-lapse. There are different tools out there to put together all these frames. LR time-lapse works very well. I consider it like the gold standard for time-lapse. You can download it for free and you can create time lapses, try it out. And this works hand in hand also with Adobe Lightroom. So you can make adjustments to the raw file, get the files looking the way you want, and then put together the time lapse. You can also, if you're on a Windows machine, you can use Corel Video Studio. You can also use Windows Video Editor, which is free and is part of the operating system. If you're on a Mac, you can use Final Cut Pro. You can also use iMovie. Pretty much any software that allows you to set the duration of each frame will allow you to put together all these frames for a time lapse. And add production value. I consider a time lapse sequence to be like a perfectly baked cake. You put together all the ingredients, it's perfectly baked, but let's make it pretty. Let's add some visual interest and audio to make it really visually and audibly appealing, such as that. Make it pretty. You can also stitch time lapses together. I have two cameras going for a sunset shoot at this is the old stone church in West Boylston, which is right outside of Boston. And I had two cameras shooting time lapses, and I ended up stitching them together. So you can take time lapses from the same moment or disparate times and put them together. Add titles and a soundtrack. Video editing programs, a lot of them have built-in free music, and you can utilize them. You can also add royalty-free music that you can download from the internet. Some of it is you pay for it, some of it is free, and you just have to, make sure that you give credit where credit is due and make sure that you acknowledge these artists in the titles. And you create a very polished video. All right. So when you select music, you know how when you watch a movie, the music really affects or accentuates the visual. And this is how it ties into time lapse as well. So think about you'll know immediately when you start listening to music what works and what kind of effect or emotional effect you want from your viewer. So keep that in mind when you're assembling your time lapses. So on that time lapse, it was clearly autumn, and I just found that when I put the time lapse together, the clouds and how the sun was bouncing off the leaves, it really looked like it was dancing, and I just found that music that seemed to have fit it perfectly. So that was once again a botched forecast. It was supposed to be clear. It was a full moon rise, but as you can see, it was not clear. Now, in that one, you may have noticed that there was some stacking going on. So what I did was I shot the sequence and then I pre-stacked 5 frames at a time and put like I had hundreds of 5 second 5 frame stacks, and then I put it together in a time lapse. So I experiment a lot, and that was one that I was experimenting with. So that was from the October 10th Aurora, and that's an example of 2 sequences put together.
Go ahead, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, just the fact that you just had the aurora kind of ties in with a question that just popped up right before you showed that. Nona was asking, I am interested in shooting the aurora and the light continuously changes. Do you use auto ISO and then set the f-stop and time?
No. At nighttime, you never use auto ISO because the camera will overcompensate. What you do is set your exposure. What I usually do is shoot at ISO 3200 and no more than 3 seconds. Now, the aurora changes intensity. It can be very, you can have flare-ups. They get very bright. But, go by the histogram, go for the middle, and don't worry about the flares getting very bright because honestly, you're capturing the transient light that the aurora is famous for. So if you're seeing the brightness, which you saw in this, you succeeded. So don't feel like you have to constantly change the exposure for as the aurora is changing, because then you're kind of flattening the moment, for the lack of a better word. So those 2 aurora sequences, they were shot with the exact same settings. I did not change the settings from the bridge to the boardwalk.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So shoot manual mode also. Any more questions?
Oh, I think we're good for now.
Okay. So this is a short sequence that I shot. It was like a half moon, and this is Cape Cod Canal. Next one is the Comet Neowise from 2020.
What's going on in that building? The lights were flashing on and off. Was it a party?
I wish it was. That is actually the old stone church. It is the only remaining building from this area that they ended up flooding 3 towns to make the reservoir, and that church was the only remaining building. And they light it up at night, and it just was flashing on and off, and that's what I got. But it's just a remnant.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So this one here I shot with 2 cameras, my normal camera and my infrared camera, and they were both photographing the same scene simultaneously, and then I just put them together. And you could just see that the infrared really captured high-level clouds that the normal camera just didn't see, and it was just a comparison type of video. Now you can also combine still and video in your time lapse as well.
You got a question?
Sure.
Just real quick, what infrared camera conversion do you have?
I have several. Don't judge me.
What was
So
that, what was that one captured on?
that was shot on a full spectrum Nikon D800 with a 720 filter.
Okay, thanks.
Yes,
You're
seven
welcome.
twenty, 720 is what I just have. I don't have the full spectrum. I just have one converted and it's the 720.
Yeah, I use different filters on my full spectrum, and for that particular night, I chose to shoot with a 720.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. What a surprise, another lighthouse. I told you I had issues. So I start off with a still. So you can make it any way you want. Let's see. Now this one here, so that one there was shot with a panning head. As you can tell, it was rotating. Since I wasn't too thrilled with the color, well, not the color, but the bland sky, I ended up taking all the frames and passing it through topaz impression. And I put together the time lapse after I applied that effect on each frame. And what it ended up looking like, you ever see those? There's some painters that they did their biography in that same kind of painterly type of look. So you can do a lot of stuff with your time-lapse frames. You can run amok, you can keep it simple. I'm always trying to see what I can come up with, and that was one of the things that I played with. And the final one. And that, let's see, do I have anything on this? That is it. Do you have any questions?
Very good. Thank you very much.
I got a question.
Sure.
In situations where you're clearly needing to change exposure, like going day to night or sunrise or whatever it is, you're in manual mode. How do you control your exposure so you don't go over, blow out your exposure or darken down too much?
So I use an app called QDSLR Dashboard to control my camera. And what that does is I have it connected to my camera, and I run it on my tablet only because I like the bigger screen. You can see the histogram, and you can change the settings while the camera is in full intervalometer shooting. Now, there's also this other gadget. Actually, it's made by the same gentleman who wrote LR Time-Lapse. It's this teeny tiny little intervalometer that sits on top of your camera in the hot shoe, and it's wired to your camera, and you can make adjustments on the fly through that. Now, because I like to have a visual, I find that I lean more on QDSLR dashboard to make changes. But these are the tools that I use, but there are other tools that I've never tried, so I can't speak to their functionality of them. But you have to like change the settings on the fly, because you cannot put your camera in aperture priority. You have to shoot in manual mode, or else the camera's going to decide, especially when you get into the dark. It's fine when it's shooting, say, well, not even too fine, when it's going from daytime into like blue hour, but you still need to control the camera, and manual's the only really way to have full control over the exposure. So QDSLR dashboard is the tool that I use. So you need a tool. You can't just do it without, you need yeah.
I imagine it's trying to keep the aperture the same, so it's somewhat controlling the shutter speed and the ISO, or do you happen to know how it's making
You
those decisions?
Meaning the app itself, the QDSLR
Yeah, I
dashboard.
mean, what is it doing?
You are doing it. You're making the changes. You decide if you're gonna open up the aperture, if you're gonna be changing the ISO. I tend not to change the shutter speed, but I do change the aperture and the ISO. And that works very well because if you start messing with the shutter speed, then you can bang into the interval and that can create problems. So if you just mess around with the ISO and the aperture, you can control how much light's coming in there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
Yeah, real quick, Dave, kind of stole, that was exactly the same question that I was gonna. So you're saying that you need that tool, you can't use, let's just say that, let's say that I'm photographing, we'll say sunrise or whatever and that. So the light's getting, brighter, and so naturally to get the right exposure, you're gonna be, in my case, my thought is probably changing the shutter speed for the most part, but maybe ISO. The other part of it too is on white balanced. A lot of times as the light's warming up or whatever, and that white balance is changing too. Are you keeping it on manual white balance, but then changing the Kelvin as you go through, or is that a auto white balance?
I use auto white balance, and then when I get into post-processing, when it's dark, during blue hour, the white balance shoots up to 8 to 10,000 degrees Kelvin. So you can handle like the daytime right into the blue hour, like with auto. But once you get into total darkness, that's when you have to change the white balance. But you can tweak that in post. You can drop the white balance down to 4,200 degrees Kelvin, and you'll get that natural look. But I usually just leave it on auto white balance and then mess around with where the white balance should be when I'm editing the raw files.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I got a question.
To get your 180-degree shutter rule at 24 frames per second. So if I'm taking a 5-second interval, do I need to have a 2.5-second exposure? Otherwise, right? So when you convert it back to 24, then you're really shooting for, because the 180 degree says you want the shutter open for half of the frame rate. And if your frame rate is 5 seconds, then do you keep your shutter at half the frame rate?
Well, no, the 180-degree
24.
rule
The
has
final
to,
frame rate is 24, the capture frame rate is 5 seconds.
right, but they're independent. I think so how to think about the 180-degree rule is if you're shooting during bright sunshine, okay, you know how like you're shooting at like maybe 1/400th of a second. That's where you need to drop it down. So that really only applies to like bright sun or bright light shooting. Um, that's where you get into the jittery thing. So you can shoot. So let me back up. So say to give you an example, say you're shooting um, ocean waves during the day, right? I want to, and I'm going to have I decided on a frame rate of 30 frame per second for my time lapse. I want to make sure that my shutter speed while I'm photographing those waves, creating a time lapse on those waves, it does not go over 1/60th of a second. So since I'm shooting during the day, I'm forced to shoot at like a fairly high shutter speed, like, whatever it is, 1/320th, 1/400th, so forth, because it's very bright. This is where the ND filter comes in, and I bring that shutter speed down to 1/60th of a second. Now keep that in mind. Now, say the sun goes down, and now I'm shooting with much slower shutter speed. Now it's a non-issue. I can drop the shutter speed down and get the histogram where I need it to be, but that interval is completely independent of that shutter speed. Does that make sense? So, okay, this is like the hardest part I know I struggled with it when I started with creating time lapse. I just could not wrap my head around this other dimension of time. It just kind of like wrecked me. But keep in mind that the shutter speed is independent of the interval. The interval itself is going to just identify when you're going to shoot the next frame. So that shutter speed is independent. The only time you have to be concerned about the shutter speed and the interval is when you're shooting at night. This is when you're using very slow shutter speeds, and now you have to accommodate that interval with that very slow shutter speed. But with daytime, it's a non-issue. You can use 1/60th of a second with a 10-second interval, or a 60-second interval, or even a 2-second interval, but it's independent.
Yeah, because if you're doing a real slow shutter speed and you try to do a 5-second exposure and your shutter speed's more than 5 seconds, you're not gonna get your interval.
Correct. And you're
And
going to
then-
confuse the camera. Yeah, it'll get ugly.
But as long as it's 1/60th or less, if you're at, say, 30 frames per second, you're fine. Doesn't matter, as long as you don't exceed 1/60th, correct?
Correct. Because when you exceed 1/60th of a second, that's when you get that choppiness to your final time lapse. It has an unnatural, like jittery feel to it. So a shutter speed of 1/60th gives a very natural looking. It'll look like when you're watching a movie or anything on television or in a theater. That shutter speed is no bigger than that. In fact, here's a test for you. Your camera, most cameras today can shoot video. If you flip your camera to video, and we're not even talking time lapse now, look at the shutter speed. It won't go over once you set the frame rate and the settings, it won't go over 1/50th or 1/60th of a second for shutter by design. And that is to prevent the resulting video from looking jittery or unnatural looking. And that same protocol applies to time lapse.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
In the chat, there's a couple.
Okay.
Kathy was asking, where can we order your books?
Oh, on my website. I'll put it in the chat. Oops. I can spell.
Okay, yeah, it popped through there. And then there was one other question. I'm trying to think of how to ask it. So Nona was asking, have you tried S&Q mode when light rapidly changing for a 30-second to 1-minute output? And I'm not sure what that is exactly.
S&Q?
Yeah, it's. Nobody ever uses it. Well, I mean, regular photographers don't use it. It might be something for time lapse on movies, but.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
Sounds like Nona's gonna do a presentation on S&Q mode.
S&Q mode. Do you
Yeah,
know
I don't know
what?
what that is. I don't know what that is.
Is that on the mirrorless Nikon then?
I believe it's on my E8.
You're gonna make me go get my camera.
Is it in the mirrorless settings, or I mean, in the video settings, maybe?
I don't know.
So
I
it's-
do remember seeing it though.
But since you don't know what it is, I'm guessing that the answer is no, you don't use that for them.
I think that's in the video.
So,
I seem to
Michael,
recall that.
Google it up. We
In
have
fact,
the
that I was,
technology.
yeah, I was gonna do that too. Let's see.
So that S&Q stands for slow and quick mode. It's a video recording function on some Sony cameras that allows users to capture slow motion and time lapse.
Oh, that's in
Oh, okay.
Sony, not Nikon. Okay.
Q.
Oh, yeah. No. It's gonna say, I don't remember seeing that. Oh, yeah. You've gone from the dark side back to the.
I've seen the light.
Interesting.
So were you predisposed to be a photographer with your last name?
Funnily enough, that it has nothing to do with photography. It actually means of the room in Italian. But people think that's like my business name, which is hilarious. But no, it's it's uh it's my married name. And my husband, who's not a photographer, always goes, "See, you got my name helps you."
You have to pay him royalties.
Pardon?
You have to pay him royalties for the use of the name.
No.
That was pretty quick. Okay. Any more questions coming in from online people?
I don't see any.
It was very helpful. A lot of stuff I learned. I mean, I've dabbled in time lapses, but I haven't been very good at it. Now I may improve my technique.
On my website, there's like I have blog posts on like creating moonrise time lapses and that stuff. But it's like one of the like anything else that we do, the more you do it, the more it clicks in your head. Because as I said, the hardest thing for us as photographers that we live in a singular state is dealing with that additional understanding of time and putting it all together, that interval and the number of frames and all that other stuff. Just keep in mind, at least 300 frames. And for folks on DSLRs, one of the things that I hear often in my workshops is like, oh, I'm going to beat up my shutter. And it's like, no, our cameras can take it and take it like you would not believe. And honestly, I've never seen a shutter fail. And if it does fail, it's like the most inexpensive thing to fix on your camera. So, just keep that in mind. Don't let um, the shutter actuations scare you.
Okay.
If you shoot in live view with your Nikons, then you don't have the shutter actuations.
Right.
True.
So
Yep.
there's that.
100% correct. And I usually have it and do it exactly that. My D850 and my D780, I put it in, the electronic shutter, and you don't hear the click, 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 click. There's no slapping. So it just does it, which works out very well.
Okay. I want to thank you for taking the time to work with us and present to us. I don't know, I learned a lot. So,
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. Thank you. We had a lot of good Q&A session in that is indicative of people who are definitely paying attention to this. As I mentioned right at the very beginning is much like Bruce just said, I've tried time lapse a few times, not very successfully, but with this, I now am inspired to go out and try it again. The thing you mentioned, LR time lapse is the kind of the benchmark or the processing. And when you're using that, is that doesn't work in conjunction with Lightroom or in Photoshop, or it's a totally independent program, right?
It's a totally independent program. The thing, what it does is it puts uh, what's the term now? It's a keyframe. So based on the time lapse and the light, it automatically creates like the keyframing. And what it does too is you do that in LR time lapse, you bring it into Lightroom, and it does the adjustments like it applies adjustments. You know how like in Lightroom you have the XMP file once you make adjustments?
yes.
It has, okay, so in LR time lapse, when you bring your raw files there and it goes and it looks at your the light in each frame, and it kind of does an equalization, meaning that some can't, like Nikon has that thing that I was telling you about to prevent the flicker on aperture priority shooting, that exposure smoothing. That is automatic in Nikon. A lot of the cameras don't have that capability, but what LR time-lapse does is if it sees like that flicker happening, it equalizes it. And then it creates the XMP file with the adjustments. When you bring it into Lightroom, you have Lightroom read the metadata, and it picks up all the adjustments that LR Time-Lapse did for you, and then you can make further adjustments, to make it pretty or whatever. And it just does a lot of the cleaning up in terms of exposure for you, and it also creates the time lapse for you. It works very well, and in the notes that I'll be sending you, it has there's a link to it, and you can like read up on it and stuff. So the stuff that I talked about tonight, it's in the notes, so you didn't have to like take notes or whatever. I know I did a brain dump, so it's a lot to absorb.
Okay, no, thank you. And when you mentioned that you have, some notes and links that you're gonna send, Bruce, will we be able to send that out to members
Yeah.
and that through?
We'll probably post it on the website.
Okay,
and
great.
We'll probably email it to the members,
Okay,
if that's
great.
okay.
Sure.
Okay, and then I guess at this point, if you're welcome to stay around if you want to hear our exciting award presentation here. Or if you'd like to go out and shoot more lighthouses, we understand.
Now, I wish I lived near one. I'd be, bye, I gotta go. But
Well, we
Yeah.
don't have very many lighthouses in Colorado, so it's kind of tough for us.
well, you guys gotta come out here. I'll take you around.
Aaron, you did a lighthouse trip, didn't you? Didn't you go up and down the coast, East Coast?
Yeah, from Portland, Maine up to Lubec.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
He's
That's
our
like
res-
my,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, you too.
He's our resident landscape pro.
Awesome. That's like my favorite place to go shoot the lighthouses. West Quaddy Light in Lubec, all the way down. And yeah, it's heavenly. But anyway. Well, I thank you guys for having me tonight. And any questions, shoot me an email. Shoot me an email.
Okay.
great, thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
All right. I'm
Bye.
gonna go drink tea now. All right. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. Thank you.